You know, false and inaccurate myths prevail in the Crested Gecko community. They start off as rumors, but they perpetuate themselves through social media. Today, we're going to feed some geckos, and we're also going to talk about over 20 of these myths, especially two that are very, very important for the supreme gecko way of keeping crested geckos. Join me. Now, there's already some really good myth videos on YouTube, especially in the past few years, by some of my good friends, such as Dakota of Dakota Blue Exotics, Nick from Lightning Morphs, and especially Brian from Altitude Exotics. But you need to watch this video because I'm going to summarize and paraphrase from those videos to save you some time. And especially don't miss the two myths at the end about supreme gecko specifically. Hey, let me know if you've heard any of these myths recently. Leave a comment down below. And especially if you have a favorite, leave a comment down below. If you have a myth that you're not sure of that you've heard, leave a comment down below. Rapid fire, let me see if I can handle all of these 20 myths in 2 sentences or less. Let's talk about crested gecko tails. The myth is crested geckos grow their tails back. This just absolutely is not true. Crested geckos lose their tails easily just by touch or the sound of a vacuum. I'm not sure where that one came from, but crested geckos do not lose their tails unless they're pulled on or extreme stress. I recently read on one of the social media platforms that crested geckos with dropped tails, females with dropped tails or floppy tails, can't breed.
Wait, what?
I'm not sure where that myth came from. Let's talk about feeding crested geckos. There's a myth that says that you have to feed your crested geckos every single day. We don't. We feed every other day. And in the winter time, we feed sometimes every 3rd day. There's a myth that crickets will hurt crested geckos. It's not so much that they'll hurt them, but they'll annoy them, just like mosquitoes in the summertime really annoy me. You have to move your crested gecko out of their enclosure to another bare tank to feed them. This just isn't true either. We feed all of our crested geckos in their initial enclosure. We provide mealworm cups to contain the insects, but moving them to another enclosure just stresses them out and actually causes them to eat less. Here's an old one. Feeding baby food is good.
Bad Deadpool.
Feeding baby food really is not good.
Good Deadpool.
It doesn't have the right nutrients for the crested geckos. If you try to add your own, it's going to be very difficult. Use one of the good established diets like Pangea or Rapacia or one of the other great diets. Let's talk about water and humidity. Crested geckos won't drink from a standing bowl. This is not correct. They absolutely will. We provide all of our adults with a water dish. Crested geckos need a high humidity and you have to mist them 2 times a day. Now, everybody's situation is a little bit different. We don't mist but every couple of days, maybe every day in the winter time. But we also have humid hides for adults and grow out crested geckos, and we also have paper towel for juvenile crested geckos too. We're going to talk more about humidity and water requirements later on in the video. That's going to be one of our very special myths that I want to talk in more detail about. Let's talk enclosures. Crested geckos are strictly arboreal and need a higher enclosure than a wide enclosure. This really isn't true as much because crested geckos can be found down on the bottom of the enclosure at times. It's more important that you give your crested geckos a tall enclosure than a long enclosure. That's not really true. It's more about the dimensions. It's more about giving them the area. Plastic tubs are terrible for crested geckos. While this isn't necessarily true, I've seen some PVC and glass enclosures set up for crested geckos that aren't great, and I've seen some wonderful, wonderful plastic tubs that are set up perfect for crested geckos. Check out this Gambit Gecko video right here. Let's talk about some miscellaneous myths that you might have heard. Crested geckos love you.
I will name him George and I will hug him and...
While I feel that crested geckos over time and lots of handling will get to a point where they'll tolerate that handling, I don't think that crested geckos ever get to a point where they actually show affection to their owners. Let me know in the comments if I'm wrong.
This is an anti-Crested Geckos Get Lonely video. I don't believe that. I'll never believe that, because they do just fine alone. Things that get lonely don't do good alone. These guys do fantastic alone.
Crested geckos should not and cannot be cohabitated, keeping multiple crested geckos together. In my personal experience, we keep several groups together year-round. We've done this for over 20 years. It works for me because we keep our animals in a basement where it gets a little bit cooler in the winter, and the animals brumate to a point. Now, I'm not saying that you should cohabitate your animals. Cohabitation is only for keepers that have the experience and also that have been doing this for a while and check on their animals on a daily or semi-daily basis. Let's take a dive for a second into crested gecko genetics. Crested geckos' patterns are dependent on the food that they're eating.
Wait a minute! Who are you?
Let's move on. No, wait for just a second. There are some factors that might contribute their food to their pattern or color changes, especially something like a Repashy Super Pig product that might change the color of crested geckos. But basically the patterns are the same no matter what food that you're feeding. Crested gecko genetics are random, and it's kind of a crapshoot putting a male and a female together and knowing what the offspring are going to look like. Well, this is somewhat true, but it's not entirely, because some genetics are established, like lily white. Other genetics are line bred, such as pinstripes, and the better the animals, the pair, the more predictable it's going to be to have babies that show mom and dad's pattern. Crested geckos are TSD, temperature sex determined. While this is true with some other reptiles, especially alligators, we know it in the hobby with leopard geckos, I don't think that there's any proof whatsoever that crested geckos can be determined by the incubation temperatures of their eggs. Crested geckos are boring because they never come out during the day. They're only nocturnal. Well, they're kind of nocturnal, but they're more crepuscular, meaning that they're more active during the dawn and dusk periods of a day. But if you handle your crested gecko during the day, it will be active. Crested geckos don't need a light cycle. I've said this over and over and over again. What happens in nature? Let's try to mimic nature as much as possible. It's okay that we have our crested geckos and they're surviving. We want them to thrive. Here at Supreme Gecko, in the fall and in the spring, we change our light cycle to mimic as close as we possibly can nature. Now, I have two more myths that I want to cover in a little bit more details. How was that lightning round? Did I keep each one at 2 sentences or so? Did I miss any myths? Let me know in the comments. Here's my 2 myths that we absolutely need to talk in more detail on. Let's circle back to what we said earlier about standing water, drinking from a standing water dish, and misting. I'm going to say it one more time. Everybody's situation is a little bit different. We know that crested geckos from misting will drink off the sides of the enclosure and off of leaves. It's so much more important that we emphasize that you have to let the enclosure dry out in between misting periods. If you don't let it dry out, you have a high potential for mold building up in your enclosure. Remember what I said earlier about the summertime? Sometimes we don't mist, but every 3rd day. But again, I have a water bowl and a hide in our grow outs and our adult enclosures. In the wintertime, our home gets about as dry as a bone, so I'm usually in there misting every single day. And on top of that, oh my gosh, this is so controversial. Our enclosures are all bare bottom tanks. Because of the way that we keep our animals, I like a bare bottom enclosure, and that really doesn't have an impact on humidity because of the practice of misting that we do. Okay, here's a myth that I am passionate about. Crested geckos can't eat mealworms. That is totally false. I absolutely love feeding mealworms, especially to baby crested geckos and grow out crested geckos. That's because they're high in protein and also because they move around quite a bit more than dubias, but they don't move around as much as crickets. So they're an easy meal that if they are sitting in front of the crested gecko's nose, crested gecko is going to pounce on them. Now, some may say don't feed mealworms to your crested geckos because that outer skin is made of chitin, which isn't good for crested geckos. Again, I'm going to say it over and over. Think about what happens in nature. In nature, they're finding insects with a very different heavy skin, outer skin exoskeleton, they're still eating them. That passes right through the crested geckos. Now, if you're feeding mealworms to your crested geckos and you're finding issues with regurgitated worms, it could be a problem with your setup. Maybe it's a problem with your heat, your temperatures. Could be a problem with unhealthy animals. Again, I'm such a big believer in feeding mealworms to crested geckos, especially when they're young. It just adds so much to their diet. And just remember, in nature, they're eating all kinds of different bugs. Here's a great video that you want to check out right here, talking more about feeder insects and your animals. Make sure you check that out. Thank you everyone for watching. We'll see you next video.